The Ark of the Covenant, the very symbol of God's presence among his people, was finally returning to Jerusalem. Could there have been a more joyous occasion for King David? After years of war and struggle, this was the moment when the heart of Israel's worship would find its rightful place. David's joy was uncontainable, and as the ark approached the city, he danced before the Lord with all his might, utterly abandoning any sense of royal decorum. Could such joy be anything but pure devotion? The streets of Jerusalem were filled with the sound of celebration. Music, singing, and the excitement of the people rose like incense to the heavens. Could this be the culmination of David's journey as king? He, the shepherd boy who had slain Goliath and united the tribes of Israel, was now dancing with the same abandon he must have felt when praising God in the fields as a boy. Was this moment not a reflection of David's heart, a heart after God's own? In stark contrast to the jubilation outside, Michal, David's wife, watched from a window in the palace. Could she truly despise him for his joy? Her heart, once filled with love for the young hero who had saved Israel, now hardened as she saw him dancing in what she deemed an undignified manner. How could a king, her king, lower himself in front of the common people? Her scorn was as palpable as the joy on the streets below. David, however, was oblivious to the disdain in Michal's heart. His focus was entirely on God. Could anything in that moment distract him from his worship? Dressed in a linen ephod, a simple garment worn by priests, David's humility before the Lord was on full display. He was not a king in that moment. He was a servant of God, leading his people in worship. Was this the secret to his greatness as a leader? Michal's reaction, though unseen by David, revealed much about her heart. Could she understand the depth of David's love for God? As the daughter of Saul, she had grown up in a palace where royal dignity and public image were paramount. Was David's unrestrained worship a direct affront to everything she had been taught about kingship? Her contempt reflected not just personal pride, but a deeper spiritual blindness. Could she see the beauty in David's humility? The Ark of the Covenant entered Jerusalem, and the people rejoiced. Could there be a more sacred moment for the nation? The Ark symbolized God's presence, his covenant with Israel, and his guidance for their future. As David danced, he embodied the nation's gratitude and worship. Could the people have felt a stronger connection to their God than in that moment? Yet, as the nation celebrated, tension brewed within the palace, setting the stage for a confrontation between David and Michal. As the day's celebrations continued, David offered sacrifices to the Lord, further humbling himself in worship. Could there be a clearer expression of his devotion? He blessed the people, gave them gifts of food, and ensured that this day would be remembered as one of unity and joy. But what awaited him at home? David's heart was full of joy, but Michal's heart was full of contempt. Could two people, so closely connected, be so spiritually divided? David, unaware of Michal's disdain, continued his exuberant worship. Could anything have dampened his joy on such a day? The king who danced before the Lord with all his might was the same man who had been anointed by God as a boy. Could Michal see that this was David's true self, one that prioritized God over royal decorum? The confrontation was inevitable, but the divide between them was already deeper than either could have imagined. To Michal's perspective, the weight of royal expectations. From her place in the palace, Michal's heart burned with pride and contempt. Could she really understand why David acted this way? As the daughter of Saul, Michal had been raised to value royal dignity and the opinions of the people. How could David, the king of Israel, lower himself to dance in such an undignified manner in front of the commoners? To her, this was not an act of worship, it was a humiliation. Could a king act like this and still maintain the respect of his people? Michal's view of royalty was shaped by her father Saul, a man whose pride and obsession with public image had ultimately led to his downfall. Could Michal be blind to the same pitfalls that had ensnared her father? Saul had once been chosen by God, but his inability to humble himself before the Lord had caused him to lose the throne. Was Michal repeating the same mistakes? Her contempt for David's joy mirrored Saul's prideful rejection of God's ways. As she watched David dance, Michal's thoughts were consumed by the expectations of royalty. Could she truly accept a king who placed worship above image? To her, the king was supposed to be above the people, a figure of dignity and control. Could she see that David's strength as a leader came from his humility before God? Michal's heart, hardened by pride, refused to recognize that true kingship came from submission to God, not the opinion of men. In that moment, Michal's contempt revealed her inner conflict. Could she ever fully embrace David's vision of leadership? David, though king, did not cling to his royal status. He danced before the Lord as an equal with the people, not as their ruler. Could Michal see the beauty in this humility, or was she too trapped by the expectations of royalty? Her heart, once open to David, was now closed by pride and judgment. Was this the beginning of her spiritual downfall? Michal's disdain for David wasn't just about his actions. It was about her own internal struggle. Could she reconcile her identity as Saul's daughter with her role as David's wife? Saul had been rejected by God, and now Michal was married to the man who had taken her father's place. Did her pride stem from a deeper resentment of David's success? The very man she once loved now embodied everything her father had lost: favor with God and the love of the people. The conflict within Michal's heart only grew as the day went on. Could she ever see David's actions as anything other than shameful? She had grown up in a world where power and image were everything, and David's joyful abandon seemed to her like weakness. Could she understand that David's strength came from his complete reliance on God? Michal's pride kept her from seeing the truth, and her scorn for David's worship was a reflection of her own spiritual blindness. As the celebration outside continued, Michal's heart grew colder. Could she ever see the joy in David's worship? The distance between them was not just physical, it was spiritual. David's love for God was pure and unrestrained, while Michal's pride kept her from experiencing the same joy. Could this divide between them ever be bridged? The tension between worship and pride, joy and contempt, would soon come to a head. Michal's refusal to embrace David's joyful worship set the stage for a confrontation. Could she truly understand the depth of David's love for God? As the daughter of Saul, Michal was trapped by the same pride that had led to her father's downfall. Was this a warning of her own fate? The story of Michal and David was no longer just about a king and his wife. It was a reflection of two opposing views of what it meant to serve God. Would pride or worship prevail? 3. David's dance, joyful abandonment to God. David danced with a joy that was unmatched. Could there be a purer expression of worship than this? The Ark of the Covenant, the very presence of God among his people, had finally returned to Jerusalem, and David's heart was overflowing with gratitude. Could a king's heart be any more aligned with God's will? Dressed in a simple linen ephod, David cast aside any royal trappings, choosing instead to humble himself before God. Could this be the secret to his success as king? The people of Jerusalem watched in awe as their king danced before the Lord. Could they have ever imagined seeing their ruler in such a state of humility and joy? David's leadership was rooted in his devotion to God, and this moment was a powerful reminder of that fact. Could his uninhibited worship be the key to his victories? David knew that his strength as king came not from his royal status, but from his relationship with God. Was this the message he wanted to send to the people? As the ark was carried into the city, David's joy only increased. Could the people feel the presence of God in this moment? The ark had long been absent from the heart of Israel's worship, and now, with its return, the nation's connection to God was being restored. Was this a moment of spiritual renewal for the entire nation? David's dance was not just a personal expression of joy, it was a symbol of the restoration of Israel's relationship with God. David's decision to wear a linen ephod, a garment typically worn by priests, was significant. Could this be a reflection of his role as both king and spiritual leader? By choosing such humble attire, David was showing the people that, in the presence of God, even the king was just another servant. Could this be why God had chosen David over Saul? Saul had clung to his royal status, but David was willing to lay it down in worship. As David danced, he was completely unaware of Michal's disdain. Could anything have dampened his joy in that moment? His heart was focused solely on God, and the opinions of others mattered little to him. Was this the key to David's strength as a leader, his ability to prioritize God above all else? The celebration around him was a testament to the power of joyful worship, and David's dance was an invitation for the entire nation to join him in honoring the Lord. The people of Jerusalem responded to David's joy with their own expressions of worship. Could this be the beginning of a new chapter in Israel's spiritual life? The ark's return to the city marked a turning point for the nation, and David's leadership was at the heart of this renewal. Was David's dance a reflection of the nation's gratitude to God? As the people watched their king dance, they saw a leader who placed God above his own reputation. Could this be the reason God's favor rested so heavily on David? David's dance was more than just a physical act, it was a spiritual declaration. Could the people see that their king's joy came from his relationship with God? In that moment, David was not just the ruler of Israel, he was a worshiper, a man after God's own heart. Could this be the key to David's legacy? His willingness to humble himself before the Lord set him apart as a leader, and his joy was contagious. Would the people follow his example? As the day's celebration came to an end, David was filled with a sense of fulfillment. Could there be a greater honor than dancing before the Lord? The ark was now in its rightful place, and the nation had witnessed a powerful display of worship. But what awaited David at home? Unbeknownst to him, Michal's heart had been hardened by pride, and the joy he felt would soon be met with scorn. Could this divide between them be healed, or was it already too late? 4. Michal's rejection, pride and spiritual blindness. As David entered his home, glowing with the joy of the day's events, he was met not with warmth, but with the coldness of Michal's contempt. Could a day of such spiritual triumph end with rejection? Michal, her face set with disdain, confronted him. Her words were sharp, biting, and filled with judgment. How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half-naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. 2 Samuel 6 verse 20. Could she truly despise him for worshipping God so openly? David, taken aback by her harshness, looked into Michal's eyes and saw not love, but pride and scorn. Could the woman he once loved have fallen so far into spiritual blindness? Her words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed how distant her heart had grown from his. Could Michal not see that his dance was for the Lord, not for the approval of men? In that moment, David realized that Michal's pride had not only divided them, but had also estranged her from God. Michal's scorn for David's dance was more than just a disagreement over royal dignity. It was a reflection of her deep-seated pride. Could she really value appearances over genuine worship? To her, a king should be above such displays of emotion, especially in front of the common people. Could she not see that David's joy was rooted in something far greater than his title? Her pride blinded her to the beauty of David's humility and to the profound significance of the ark's return. David, still standing before her, did not falter. His response was calm, yet firm. It was before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father, or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. Could David's words cut deeper than Michal expected? In reminding her that God had chosen him over Saul, David touched on the very source of Michal's pride, her identity as the daughter of the fallen king. Could this be the true root of her bitterness? David's defense was not just about justifying his actions, it was about declaring his devotion to God. Could Michal ever understand the depth of his love for the Lord? David made it clear that he would continue to worship God with all his heart, regardless of how others perceived him. Could Michal's pride withstand such a declaration of devotion? For David, the opinion of God mattered far more than the opinion of men, or even his wife. Could this be the dividing line between them? Michal's pride had blinded her to the truth. Could she not see that David's strength as a king came from his humility before God? In rejecting David's worship, she was not just rejecting him, she was rejecting the God he worshipped. Could her heart have grown so cold that she could no longer recognize the presence of God in her own home? Michal's pride, like her father Saul's, had become her downfall. Could this confrontation be the final wedge that would divide them forever? The confrontation between David and Michal left a lasting scar on their marriage. Could their relationship ever recover from this moment? Scripture tells us that Michal had no children for the rest of her life. 2 Samuel 6:23, a detail that carries both physical and spiritual significance. Could her barrenness symbolize the spiritual barrenness that had taken root in her heart? Michal's rejection of David's worship was not just a personal failing, it was a spiritual one. Could this be the price of pride? As David left Michal's presence, he knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. Could a marriage survive such a deep spiritual divide? The joy of the day had been overshadowed by Michal's pride, and the unity that once existed between them was now fractured. Could David continue to lead Israel, knowing that his own household was divided? The contrast between David's joyful worship and Michal's prideful rejection would echo through their lives and through the history of Israel. 5. The cost of contempt, Michal's barren future. Michal's rejection of David's worship came with consequences, ones that would shape the rest of her life. Could her scorn truly lead to such a harsh outcome? The Bible is clear. After her confrontation with David, Michal remained childless for the rest of her days. 2 Samuel 6:23. Could this be a direct result of her pride and contempt? In a time when bearing children was seen as a blessing from God, Michal's barrenness would have been viewed as a sign of divine disfavor. Could this be the ultimate price for scorning what God values? Her barrenness was more than just a physical condition. It was a reflection of the spiritual barrenness that had taken root in her heart. Could her pride have blocked the blessings of God? Michal, once the daughter of a king, now found herself alone, her heart hardened by the same pride that had led to her father Saul's downfall. Could she see the parallels between her own life and her father's? Both had been given opportunities to humble themselves before God, and both had rejected them. Was Michal's fate sealed by the same pride that had destroyed her father? The silence in Michal's home must have been deafening. Could she ever come to terms with the consequences of her actions? Childless and alone, Michal's life became a living testament to the dangers of pride. Could she ever recognize that her rejection of David's worship was, in fact, a rejection of God's presence? The Ark of the Covenant had entered Jerusalem, bringing with it the promise of God's blessings. But Michal had turned away, and now those blessings would not come to her. Michal's barrenness was not just a personal loss. It was a symbol of the broken relationship between her and David. Could the divide between them ever be healed? The confrontation over David's dance had revealed a deep spiritual chasm between them, one that could not be bridged by mere words. Could Michal's pride have destroyed what once could have been a strong partnership? Her scorn for David's worship had cost her more than just her dignity. It had cost her her future. The story of Michal serves as a powerful warning about the dangers of pride and the consequences of rejecting God's ways. Could Michal have known that her disdain for David's joy would lead to such lasting repercussions? In rejecting David's worship, Michal had also rejected the very source of life and blessing. Was her barrenness a reflection of her spiritual emptiness? The legacy she left behind was not one of joy or fruitfulness, but one of isolation and pride. For David, the consequences of Michal's pride were clear. Could he continue to lead Israel, knowing that his own household was divided? The king who danced before the Lord with all his might was now bound to a wife who could not share in his joy. Could this be a reflection of the divide between Saul's legacy and David's reign? Michal, as the daughter of Saul, represented a past that was marked by pride and rejection of God's ways, while David's future was rooted in humility and devotion. Michal's fate serves as a reminder of the cost of rejecting God's blessings. Could her story still speak to us today about the dangers of pride? In a world that often values appearance and status over humility and devotion, Michal's scorn for David's joyful worship is a cautionary tale. Could we too fall into the trap of valuing human dignity over divine worship? The story of Michal and David reminds us that true kingship, true leadership, and true worship come from a heart that is fully surrendered to God. As Michal's story comes to a close, the legacy she leaves behind is one of barrenness, both physical and spiritual. Could her life have been different if she had embraced David's joy instead of despising it? The answer is clear. Michal's pride and contempt led her down a path of isolation, while David's humility and devotion brought him closer to God's heart. Could this be the ultimate lesson of their story? That the path to true joy, fruitfulness, and blessing lies in humble worship, not in the prideful rejection of God's ways. 6. David's legacy, the power of worship. David's legacy as a man after God's own heart was firmly established on that day when he danced before the Lord. Could there be a clearer example of his devotion? His willingness to humble himself before God, even at the risk of public scorn, set him apart as a leader. Could this be why God chose David over Saul? Unlike Saul, who clung to his royal status, David understood that true kingship came from submission to God. Was this the secret to David's success as king? Throughout his life, David would be remembered not just for his victories in battle, but for his heart of worship. Could this be what made him Israel's greatest king? David's willingness to lay aside his royal robes and dance with abandon before the Lord was a testament to his deep relationship with God. Could this be the key to David's strength as a leader? His joy came not from his position as king, but from his love for God. Was this the true source of his power? The story of David's dance became a defining moment in his reign. Could it have set the tone for the rest of his leadership? By placing God above all else, above his reputation, his dignity, and even his royal status, David showed the people of Israel what it meant to be a true servant of God. Could this be why the people loved him so deeply? David's dance was not just an act of worship, it was a declaration that God was the true King of Israel. David's humility before God would echo throughout the generations. Could this moment have shaped the future of Israel's worship? His example of uninhibited, joyful worship set a precedent for how the nation would approach their relationship with God. Could the people see that their king's joy came from his devotion to the Lord? David's leadership was rooted in worship, and his dance before the ark became a symbol of the power of worship to transform both individuals and nations. As the years passed, David's legacy as a worshiper became inseparable from his identity as a king. Could this be what distinguished him from other rulers? His willingness to humble himself before God, even in moments of great triumph, showed that he understood the true source of his authority. Could this be why God's favor rested so heavily upon him? David's dance was a reflection of his heart, and it was this heart that made him the greatest king in Israel's history. For the people of Israel, David's dance became a symbol of joy, freedom, and devotion. Could this be the lasting impact of his reign? His leadership, marked by humility and worship, set the nation on a path of renewed relationship with God. Could this be the legacy that God intended for Israel's kings? David's willingness to place God above his own pride and dignity was a powerful reminder of what true kingship looked like in the eyes of the Lord. David's legacy of worship would be remembered not just by his people, but by future generations. Could his dance before the ark still inspire us today? His example of uninhibited worship, free from the fear of human judgment, calls us to examine our own hearts. Could we, too, learn to worship with the same abandon and joy? David's legacy reminds us that true worship comes from a heart that is fully surrendered to God, regardless of what others may think. As we look back on David's life, it's clear that his greatest victories were not won on the battlefield, but in the moments when he humbled himself before God. Could this be the ultimate lesson of his reign? That true strength, true leadership, and true joy come from a heart that is fully devoted to the Lord. Could we follow David's example in our own lives, choosing to worship God with all our might, regardless of what the world may think? 7. Michal's legacy, the tragedy of pride. Michal's legacy stands in stark contrast to David's. Could her fate have been different if she had embraced David's joy? Her life, once filled with the promise of royalty and marriage to a beloved king, became marked by bitterness, pride, and barrenness. Could her rejection of David's worship have led to her own spiritual downfall? Michal's scorn for David on that day sealed her future, not only in her marriage, but in her place in history. Could her pride have cost her more than just her relationship with David? Michal, the daughter of Saul, carried the weight of her father's legacy. Could she have escaped the same pride that led to Saul's downfall? Saul, who had also been chosen by God, had fallen from favor because of his disobedience and pride. Could Michal have seen the parallels between her father's story and her own? Just as Saul had lost his kingdom through pride, Michal lost the chance to share in David's legacy through her rejection of his worship. Was her fate tied to the spiritual blindness that plagued her family? Unlike David, whose legacy was one of worship and devotion, Michal is remembered for her contempt. Could this be the ultimate tragedy of her life? In rejecting David's joy, she rejected the opportunity to be part of a legacy rooted in God's favor. Could she have been part of David's story of devotion to God if she had humbled herself? Instead, she remains a symbol of what happens when pride blinds us to the beauty of worship and devotion to the Lord. Was Michal's story a warning for future generations? Michal's childlessness, both physical and spiritual, became the lasting symbol of her pride. Could she have known that her rejection of David's worship would lead to such lasting consequences? The barrenness she experienced was more than just a personal tragedy. It was a reflection of the spiritual emptiness that had taken hold of her heart. Could Michal have avoided this fate if she had opened her heart to the joy that David experienced before the Lord? Her life serves as a reminder of the cost of pride and the consequences of rejecting God's blessings. As time passed, Michal's story faded into the background of David's reign, but the impact of her actions remained. Could she have played a greater role in Israel's history if she had embraced the same humility that marked David's leadership? Instead, her life became a footnote, a tragic example of how pride and contempt can lead to isolation and barrenness. Could this be a warning for all who place their own pride above the worship of God? Michal's story serves as a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of rejecting what God values. Michal's relationship with David was irrevocably damaged by her pride. Could their marriage have survived if she had chosen humility over judgment? The divide between them, rooted in their differing views of worship and leadership, became insurmountable. Could Michal's legacy have been different if she had embraced David's devotion to God? Instead, her story became a reflection of the same pride that had brought down her father. Was Michal destined to repeat the same mistakes that had destroyed Saul's legacy? For David, Michal's rejection was a painful reminder of the cost of leadership. Could he have foreseen the tension that would arise between his devotion to God and his marriage to Saul's daughter? Michal, like her father, could not understand that true kingship came from humility before God, not from the approval of men. Could David's willingness to worship with abandon have been the very thing that alienated Michal from him? Their relationship became a casualty of the spiritual divide between Saul's legacy and David's reign. Michal's life, marked by pride, rejection, and barrenness, stands as a powerful counterpoint to David's legacy of joy, worship, and fruitfulness. Could her story still speak to us today about the dangers of pride and the importance of humility before God? In a world that often values appearance and status over true devotion, Michal's rejection of David's worship serves as a stark reminder of the cost of placing human dignity above divine worship. Could her legacy have been different if she had chosen to join David in his joyful abandonment before the Lord? 8. A lesson in devotion and humility. David's dance before the Ark of the Covenant remains one of the most powerful symbols of worship in the Bible. Could there be a clearer example of what it means to worship God with abandon? David's willingness to cast aside his royal dignity in favor of humble devotion to God sets him apart as a leader who understood the true source of his strength. Could this be the ultimate lesson of his reign? That true kingship comes from placing God above all else, even above one's own reputation. Michal's rejection of David's worship serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers of pride. Could her story still resonate with us today? In a world that often values external appearances and status over genuine devotion, Michal's scorn for David's dance warns us of the cost of placing pride above worship. Could we, like Michal, miss the blessings of God because we are too concerned with what others think? Her story calls us to examine our own hearts and to prioritize our relationship with God above all else. The contrast between David's joy and Michal's contempt highlights a profound spiritual truth. Could the difference between a heart of worship and a heart of pride determine the course of our lives? David's legacy is one of joy, fruitfulness, and divine favor, while Michal's is one of barrenness and rejection. Could this be the ultimate message of their story? That humility before God leads to life and blessing, while pride leads to isolation and emptiness. David's leadership, rooted in worship and humility, set the tone for the future of Israel's relationship with God. Could his example still inspire us today? His dance before the Lord reminds us that true worship comes from the heart, and that no position or title should prevent us from expressing our love for God. Could we learn to worship with the same freedom and joy that David displayed? His story encourages us to cast aside the fear of human judgment and to embrace the joy of being in God's presence. Michal's life, marked by pride and rejection, serves as a powerful warning. Could her story have been different if she had embraced David's worship instead of despising it? The answer is clear. Her pride led her down a path of isolation and barrenness, while David's humility brought him closer to God and to the blessings of leadership. Could we too fall into the trap of pride if we reject the joy that comes from worshiping God with all our hearts? Michal's story calls us to humility, reminding us that God's favor rests on those who seek Him with sincere hearts. The lesson of David's dance and Michal's contempt is one of devotion and humility. Could their story still speak to us today about the importance of putting God first? David's willingness to humble himself before the Lord sets an example for all believers, showing that true worship comes not from our outward appearances, but from the condition of our hearts. Could we follow David's example and choose worship over pride? His story invites us to join him in the dance of joyful abandonment before the Lord. As we reflect on the legacy of David and Michal, we are reminded that the choices we make in our relationship with God have lasting consequences. Could we learn from their story and choose humility over pride, worship over contempt? David's joy in the presence of God brought life and blessing, while Michal's rejection of that joy led to barrenness and isolation. Could their story inspire us to seek God with all our hearts, casting aside the fear of human judgment? In the end, David's legacy is one of joy, worship, and humility, while Michal's is one of pride, barrenness, and rejection. Could we learn from both of their stories? The call of their lives echoes through the ages, inviting us to embrace the joy of worship and to humble ourselves before the Lord. Could we, too, join David in dancing before the Lord with all our might, casting aside our pride and embracing the joy of being in His presence? The story of David's dance and Michal's contempt invites us to reflect on our own relationship with God. What about you? Have you ever found yourself more concerned with what others think than with fully worshiping God? Could pride be holding you back from experiencing the fullness of joy in God's presence? David's example calls us to cast aside our fears and to worship with abandon. Will you join him in the dance of joyful worship? If this story resonated with you, don't stop here. Subscribe to our channel for more biblical narratives and reflections that challenge and inspire your faith. Share your thoughts. Have you ever felt like Michal, judging others for their expressions of worship? Or have you, like David, experienced the freedom that comes from worshiping God with all your heart? Let us know in the comments below, and let's discuss how we can apply these lessons to our own lives. How will you choose to worship God this week? Will you dance before the Lord with all your might, or will you hold back out of fear of judgment? Comment below.